An Ontological Idealism by John McTaggart, Ellis McTaggart. Ontologically, I am an idealist, since I believe that all that exists is spiritual. I am also, in one sense of the term, a personal idealist, for I believe that every part of the content of spirit falls within some self, and that no part of it falls within more than one self, and that the only substances are selves, parts of selves, and groups of selves, or parts of selves. On the other hand, I should say that epistemologically, I was a realist. I should say that knowledge was a true belief, and I should say that a belief was true when, and only when, it stands in a relation of correspondence to fact. I do not think that this particular relation of correspondence can be defined further, but it may be remarked that it is not a relation of copying or similarity. Of facts, I should say that whenever anything is anything, using both anything and is in the widest possible sense, it is a fact that it is so. I should define philosophy as the systematic study of the ultimate nature of reality. The phrase ultimate nature distinguishes philosophy from science, which systematically studies the nature of reality, but not its ultimate nature. Reality appears to me to be an indefinable quality, for which being is another name. Nothing is unreal. When we say that the present Duke of London is unreal, what we mean is that the description, quote, the present Duke of London, end quote, is a description which applies to nothing. Existence appears to me to be another indefinable quality, which is such that all which is existent is necessarily real, but all which is real is not necessarily existent. It has been said that propositions, possibilities, qualities, and relations are real without being existent. I do not think that the independent reality of propositions or possibilities can be justified, but qualities and relations, which may be grouped together under the general name of characteristics, are in themselves real without being existent. The qualities and relations of existent substances, however, may be called as such existent. I have confined myself to a study of the nature of existence. It is the existent alone which is any practical interest for us, and the nature of the existent involves the nature of all other reality. Since, taking any quality X, it is clear that each existent thing must have either that quality or the quality not X, whose nature depends on the nature of X. I have divided my system into two parts. The first admits only two empirical premises, quote, something exists, end quote, and, quote, what exists is differentiated, end quote. The rest of it professes to be entirely a priori. In the second part, the results obtained in the first part will be applied to those general characteristics which empirical observation tells us are, or appear to be, true of various parts of the existent. Footnote. The first part is contained in Volume 1 of The Nature of Existence, published in 1921. The second part will occupy Volume 2 of the same work, which I hope to publish in 1926 or 1927. Reader's note. The Nature of Existence, Volume 2, was posthumously published by Dr. C.D. Broad in 1927, after McTaggart's death. End reader's note. We know empirically that something exists. This is given us in perception. I use the words perception and awareness in the senses in which they are defined by Mr. Russell in his Mysticism and Logic. And if it should be denied or doubted that anything existed, then the very assertion of, or denial, or doubt would show that, at least, the assertion in question existed. Existence is a quality, and it is evident that whatever exists must have some quality besides existence. The conception of quality is indefinable. For every positive quality, X, there is a negative quality, not X, and one member of this pair can be predicated of everything that exists. Some qualities are simple and do not admit of analysis. Others are compound, consisting of an aggregate of simple qualities. Others are complex, which do not consist of simple qualities, but can be analyzed and defined by means of simple qualities and simple relations. Negative qualities are complex. The compound quality, which is an aggregate of all the non-compound qualities possessed by anything, may be called the nature of that thing. I hold that the existence of qualities involves the existence of substances. I should define a substance as that which has qualities and is related without being itself either a quality or a relation, or having qualities or relations among its parts. The first part of this is the traditional definition of substance. The last part is added to exclude facts. Footnote. The latter part was added to meet Professor J.E. Moore's objection that the definition of substance in The Nature of Existence, Volume 1, does not preclude facts from being substances. Thus, by his emendation here, McTaggart presumably wishes to insist that facts do have, though substances do not have, qualities or relations among their parts. End footnote. By this definition, many things would be called substances which are not usually called so, such as a sneeze, or the group consisting of all red-headed archdeacons. Is there only one substance, or are there more? Here, for a second time, and the last in the first part of my system, I appeal to perception, which shows us that more substances than one exist. But, at the same time, all the substances which exist may be taken together as a single substance. Since there are more substances than one, they must exist in relations to one another. Though, of course, relations also exist between qualities and relations, just as both qualities and relations have qualities. The conception of relation is indefinable, like the conception of quality. It is as fundamental as the conception of quality, and it is impossible to dispense with either of them in favor of the other. Every relationship generates a derivative quality in each of its terms, the quality of being a term in that relationship. In the same way, a derivative relation is generated between any quality and the substance which has it, and between every relation and each of its terms. Thus, infinite series of characteristics are generated, but these infinite series are not vicious. It seems clear to me that two substances cannot have exactly the same nature. The difference, however, may not be a difference in original qualities, but may consist entirely in a difference in original relations, together with the difference in the derivative characteristics generated by those relations. This result may be called the dissimilarity of the diverse. Substances, being particular, cannot be defined, but they may be described. A description which applies only to one substance is an exclusive description of it. An exclusive description which is entirely in terms of qualities and relations without introducing undescribed substances, I call a sufficient description. Since no two substances have exactly the same nature, every substance has an exclusive description, and it can be shown to follow from this that to avoid a vicious infinite series, every substance must have a sufficient description. Some characteristics clearly imply others, since it is sometimes true that if one substance has characteristic X, that substance, or another, which stands to it in some definite relation, will have the characteristic Y. This may be called intrinsic determination. But besides this, there is a relation between all the characteristics of the same substance, such that if any one of them were not a characteristic of that substance, we could not assert that any others of them were characteristics of that substance. This relation I have called extrinsic determination. The nature of a substance may be regarded as a unity, compounded of the particular characteristics which constitute it. But it may be regarded with equal truth as a unity which is manifested in those characteristics. We now pass from the consideration of single substances to the consideration of groups. By a group, I mean any collection formed of substances, or of collections of substances, or of both. These substances, or collections, which form the collection, are members of the group. A group is distinguished from a class which is determined by a class concept, while a group is determined by denotation. Any combination of substances or groups is a group, however trivial or unimportant the similarities and connections between its members. We must distinguish between the members and parts of a group. If we take the group of all counties in Great Britain, Surrey is both a member and a part of it. England and Whitechapel are parts but not members. The relation of whole and part appears to me to be indefinable. At this point, we must introduce two further conceptions. A set of parts of any whole is a collection of its parts which together make up the whole, and do not do more than make it up, so that the whole would not be made up if any of those parts or their parts should be subtracted. A group may have many sets of parts, and I use the term content of the group to designate that plurality which is identical in various sets of parts of a group. It follows from the definitions of a substance and a group that every group is a compound substance, but that several groups may be the same compound substance, e.g., the group of the counties of England and the group of the parishes of England are the same compound substance. There is no group which contains all other groups, but there is one substance which contains all other substances. This substance is the universe. By means of the conception of the universe, we can show that extrinsic determination is more extensive than was previously asserted, and that every fact about any substance extrinsically determines every fact about every other substance. I pass to a position which is very vital to my system, the position that no substance is simple. It is possible that a substance is simple in some of its dimensions, but it could not be simple in all of them. This proposition appears to me to be self-evident and ultimate. I do not, therefore, attempt to defend it by direct arguments, though I believe that it is possible, by various explanations, to remove certain objections which might naturally be made to it. Every substance, therefore, will have an infinite number of sets of parts. When two sets are such that no part in the second falls within more than one part of the first, while at least one part of the first set contains two or more parts of the second, I call the first set precedent to the second, and the second sequent to the first. But now a difficulty arises. When the occurrence of the quality X determines intrinsically the occurrence of either the quality Y or the quality Z, but does not intrinsically determine whether it shall be Y or Z, which does occur, let us say that X presupposes one of the two, Y or Z, which does actually occur. X may have more than one presupposition, and two of them may be such that when one of them is fixed to one of the alternatives, it implies the fixing of the other to one of the alternatives. Let us define the total ultimate presupposition of X as being the aggregate of all the presuppositions of X after all those have been removed, the fixing of which is implied in the fixing of any of those which remain. It is clear that whatever has a presupposition must have a total ultimate presupposition. But I maintain that it can be demonstrated that the sufficient descriptions of the members of any set of parts of a substance would, except on one condition, have a presupposition without a total ultimate presupposition, which is absurd. The one condition on which this could be avoided must therefore be true. And that condition is that there must be some description of any substance A, which implies sufficient descriptions of the members of all its sets of parts, which are sequent to some given set of parts. I think there is only one way in which this result can be attained. Let A have a set of parts, B and C. Let it be true in the first place. that each of these parts has a set of parts corresponding to each set of parts of A. In the second place, let it be true that the correspondence is of the same sort throughout, and that it is such that a certain sufficient description of C, which includes the fact that it is in this relation to some part of B, will determine a sufficient description of the part of B in question. And in the third place, let it be true that the correspondence is such that when one determinant is part of another determinant, then any part determined by the first will be part of a part determined by the second. I write B factorial C for that part of B which corresponds to C, and B factorial C factorial D for that part of B which corresponds to that part of C which corresponds to D, and so on. I call such correspondence a determining correspondence, since by it, with the help of sufficient descriptions of B and C, we can determine a sufficient description of B factorial C. I speak of C as the determinant of B factorial C, and of B factorial C as the determinant of C, or as determined by C. I say that B factorial C factorial D is directly determined by C factorial D, and indirectly determined by D. I call A primary whole, and B a primary part. I call B factorial C a secondary part of the first grade, B factorial C factorial D a secondary part of the second grade, and so on. If the conditions mentioned above are fulfilled, it follows that sufficient descriptions of the primary parts will determine sufficient descriptions of parts of A through an infinite series. We shall then have fulfilled the only condition by fulfilling which it is possible to escape from the contradiction which would otherwise be involved in the infinite divisibility of substance. And, as there seems no other theory which would fulfill this condition, I hold that we are entitled to regard the theory of determining correspondence as true, and to assert that the universe consists of one or more primary wholes, which again consist of primary parts, whose further parts are determined by determining correspondence. It is not necessary, in order to establish determining correspondence, that each primary part should have parts corresponding to all the primary parts in its primary whole. It might have parts corresponding only to a certain number of them, e.g., to B and C, when the primary whole contained B, C, D, and E. Nor is it necessary that every primary part should be a determinate at all, though, of course, every primary part must be a determinate. If, as I believe, causation is to be defined as a relation of intrinsic determination between the occurrence of existing qualities, it follows that determining correspondence is a causal relation, and consequently that a network of causal relations spreads through every primary part of the universe, though it does not follow that the occurrence of every existing quality is causally determined. Determining correspondence also involves a classification of the content of the universe into primary wholes, primary parts, secondary parts of the first grade, of the second grade, and so on. It can be shown that this classification is based on qualities which are of fundamental importance, and it may therefore be called the fundamental system of the universe. In order that the secondary parts may be differentiated by determining correspondence, it is necessary that the primary parts should be differentiated independently of determining correspondence. This could happen in several ways. It might happen by a difference in original qualities, or by a difference in the sort of relations in which they stand to other things. Or again, it might happen by a difference in the terms to which they stood in certain relations. Though this last method of differentiation could not be the only method applicable to all primary parts, since that would involve a vicious infinite. I now pass to the second part of my philosophy. As yet unpublished, in which the results obtained in the first part will be applied to those general characteristics which empirical observation tells us are, or appear to be, true of various parts of the existent. Footnote. This second part occupies volume 2 of the nature of existence. End footnote. In this part of the system, it is impossible to hope for the absolute demonstration of positive results. The most that we can do is to show that certain empirically known characteristics will meet the a priori requirements of the first part, and that no other characteristic, which we know or can imagine, will do so. But this will not assure us that the universe does possess these characteristics, for there may be others which we have never experienced or imagined, which could also satisfy the a priori requirements. And it may be these latter which are found in part or all of the existent. But although we cannot attain absolute demonstration here, we may, I think, attain reasonable certainty. With negative results, we may be able to reach absolute demonstration if we are certain a priori that nothing with the quality x can be real. We can be certain that any empirically known characteristic which involves the quality x cannot be true of reality. It seems to me that one empirically known characteristic which cannot really belong to anything that exists, is the characteristic of time. I can only briefly summarize the argument which leads me to this conclusion. It is that nothing can be really in time unless it really forms a series of past, present, and future, which may be called the A series, as well as a series of earlier and later, which may be called a B series. But the A series involves a contradiction, for every term of it is both past, present, and future. And, on the other hand, the three predicates are incompatible. But again, we cannot regard the time series as totally erroneous. The terms which appear to us as a temporal series connected by the relation earlier than really do form a non-temporal series connected by another relation. This I call the C series. It follows, from what I have said, that things are really in a C series, but not really in any A or B series. We must also, I think, hold that nothing which exists can have the quality of being matter. My positive reason for holding this conclusion is that it appears impossible for anything which has the quality of materiality to have that determining correspondence between its parts, which we have seen that all substances must have. This conclusion, however, can be supported, as I have endeavored to show in the 3rd chapter of Some Dogmas of Religion, that the positive arguments put forward for the existence of matter are untenable. It also seems inevitable that we should reject the reality of sense data. I do not mean that we must deny that we have objects which we perceive, but that we must hold that those objects have not the nature which is usually connoted by the name sense data. The ground for this assertion is, again, that nothing which has the quality of being a sense datum can have determining correspondence between its parts. This position, like that of the unreality of time, involves that perception is sometimes erroneous. I use perception to mean the direct awareness of any substance. The unreality of matter does not involve erroneous perception, since we never perceive anything as being material, though we judge it to be material. What then shall we say about spirit? What, in the first place, do we mean by spirit? I should say that spirituality is the quality of having content in the sense previously defined, all of which is content of one or more selves. I should say that the quality of being a self is a simple quality, which is known to me because I perceive, in the strict sense of the word, one substance as possessing it. This substance is myself. With regard to selves, I hold further that a self can be conscious without being self-conscious, and that it is possible for a self not to be self-conscious. I also hold that it is impossible for one self to be part of another self, or for two selves to have any common part. The activities which spirits have, or appear prima facie to have, are perceptions, awareness of characteristics, judgments, assumptions, images, volitions, and emotions. By perceptions, as I have said, I mean the awareness of any substance. But since we can base judgments as to the characteristics of substances on our perceptions of those substances, we must conclude that although we cannot perceive that the substance A has the characteristic X, we can perceive that substance A as having the characteristic X. There are three propositions about perception for which I think good reasons can be given. The first is that there is no intrinsic impossibility in a self perceiving another self, or a part of another self. The second is that a perception is a part of a percipient self. The third is that a perception of the part of a whole can be a part of a perception of that whole. Then it follows that perception could be a relation of determining correspondence. We might have a primary whole, all of whose primary parts were selves, each of whom perceived all or some of the selves in the primary whole, and also perceived all the parts of each self it perceived. And it might be the case that each self had only one perception of each perception, and that he had no other contents but these perceptions. And in this case, sufficient descriptions would be determined within each self of parts within parts to infinity. For each part would be sufficiently described by the description that it was the perception which a given self had of a given self, or of a given perception within a given self. In order that this should be the case, it would be necessary that each self should have a sufficient description which did not depend on determining correspondence. Such a description might be based either on qualitative or quantitative differences between the selves, or both, combined possibly with differences in relations. It can be further shown that while perception can thus give us determining correspondence, neither judgments, assumptions, images, nor awareness of characteristics can do so. There must be some substances whose parts admit of determination to infinity by determining correspondence. For there could be no substance which does not meet this requirement, and we know that there are some substances. Only three sorts of substance appear to be given us in experience: matter, sense data, and spirit. We do not know, and we cannot imagine, any others. We have seen that no substance can really be matter or sense data. This does not absolutely prove that all substances or any substances are spirits. For perhaps some substances, or all substances, are of some nature which we do not know and cannot even imagine. But, although we have here not any absolute demonstration, we have, I think, good reason to believe that all reality is spiritual. In other words, that nothing exists except selves, groups of selves, and parts of selves. What then about volition and emotion? I hold, in accordance with a view suggested by Dr. Moore, that a desire or an emotion is primarily a cogitation of the object of desire or emotion, which has the further quality, ultimate and irreducible to any other sort of quality, which makes it a desire or an emotion. I hold that perceptions, which are cogitations, can be volitions and emotions. Each of us has a perception of at least one other self, and I think that good reason can be shown for concluding that the relation in which a self stands to a self which it perceives is a relation of love. The percipient self loving the perceived self. By love, I mean what is generally meant by the word, an emotion felt by one person towards another person. This is the fact which decides all other emotions. If I love A, I shall regard myself with reverence, because I love him. If I indirectly perceive B by perceiving A's perception of him, then, since I love A and A loves B, I shall regard B with a feeling which may be distinguished from love by calling it affection, and I shall regard with complacency the parts of selves whom I regard with love, self-reverence, or affection. There remains volition. Our perceptions cannot be ungratified volitions, since their objects exist. But are they gratified volitions, or not volitions at all? This question is answered by our last result. We cannot but acquiesce in the existence of what we regard with love, self-reverence, affection, or complacency, and the essence of volition is acquiescence. If our conclusions are correct, The universe consists of selves arranged in one or more primary wholes, whose whole content consists in their perceptions of themselves and of each other. Perceptions which have emotional and volitional qualities, such as those in our present experience. But there is reason to believe much more intense in quality than they are in our present experience. Are such selves immortal? If we take immortality to mean endless existence in time, and I think it should be taken in this way, it is clear that selves cannot really be immortal, since they are not really in time. But the question still remains whether, when they appear, sub specie temporis, their lives will appear as having, or not having, an end in time. If the universe, the whole of that which exists, is of this nature, can it include a self who is God? I use God to designate a being who is a self who is good, and whose power is such that whether he does or does not create all other selves, his volition can profoundly affect them. It is clear to begin with that there can be no one who is really the creator of the universe, since the created must be in time, even if the creator could be timeless, and since nothing is in time. Nor could there even be a being who sub specie temporis appeared as a creator. For this, there are three reasons. In the first place, both God and the other selves would be primary parts, and they could not be dependent on God in any way in which God was not dependent on them. In the second place, God's volitions respecting them, like all volitions of all primary selves, would be cognitively perceptions, and therefore they would depend on their objects, and not their objects on them. In the third place, I think that it can be proved that sub specie temporis, all selves begin simultaneously, so that God could not appear to be prior to the other selves in time. The first and third of these objections do not apply to the view that God, while not creating the rest of the universe, controls it, but the second objection would apply to this hypothesis alone. It might be said, it is certainly the case that the volitions of selves do appear to affect the state of the rest of the universe. And could there not be some self whose volitions had the appearance, which would be a phenomenon bene fundatum, of influencing the rest of the universe so profoundly that he would properly be called a god? And could there not be some self whose volitions had the appearance, which, though only an appearance, would be phenomenon bene fundatum, of influencing the rest of the universe so profoundly that he would properly be called a god? There might be such a being, but there seems no evidence which should make his existence probable, and it must be noted that if our theory is true, the force of the argument from design would be greatly weakened, if not entirely destroyed, since it can be shown that a certain amount of order, and, as we shall see later, a certain direction towards the good follows from the intrinsic nature of existence, and so does not suggest a conscious designer as its only possible cause. It is clear that, if this is the real nature of what exists, it appears to be something very different from what it is. 1. It appears to include matter and sense data, while really it includes nothing but spirit. 2. I appear to perceive myself, parts of myself, sense data, and nothing else. But in reality, I do not perceive sense data, and I do perceive other selves and their parts. 3. I appear to have judgments, assumptions, and images, when in reality, the whole content of myself consists in presentations. 4. Many of my volitions and emotions appear to be judgments, assumptions, or images, while in reality, they are all perceptions. 5. All that I perceive appears to be in time, while in reality, nothing is in time. Can we explain how reality should appear to be so different from what it really is? This will involve our accepting the possibility of erroneous perception. Even if part of our cognition consisted of judgments, some of the errors in appearance mentioned above must be put down to perception. And, if our theory is true, all our cognition is really perception, and so all error must fall in perception. But is it not an essential and self-evident characteristic of perception that there is no possibility that it should be erroneous? And, if we remove this characteristic from anything, do not we thereby declare that it is not perception? But, when we look more closely, we see that our certainty as to the correctness of perception is only that what I perceive exists, and exists as I perceive it, at the time at which I perceive it. And there is no certainty about any other time. We have seen that time is unreal. The condition, quote, at the time at which I perceive it, end quote, must be translated into something else before it gives us the truth. And, if that translation should allow for erroneous perception, we shall have achieved our end. It is clear, therefore, that the explanation of all error must be closely associated with the appearance of time. It is only possible for me here to state what my theory is, omitting both the arguments which seem to me to render it impossible to accept various alternative theories, and also the exposition of the way in which I think that this theory does explain satisfactorily, in detail, the difference of the appearance from reality. The content of all selves, as we have seen, forms a system of perceptions, which is determined by determining correspondence, and is in two dimensions. One dimension being the series of primary parts, secondary parts of the first grade, secondary parts of the second grade, and so on, infinitely, while the other dimension is the series of parts in each grade. I believe that each of these parts is divided in another dimension into a series of other parts. The parts in this dimension are not determined by determining correspondence, and so must be simple parts, though, so far as I can see, there is nothing to determine whether their number is finite or infinite. The series, as we shall see, is bounded at both ends, but might contain an infinite number of parts if there were no next terms. I hold that in any perception g factorial h, all these parts are states of misperception by g of h, while g factorial h, of which they are parts, is a correct perception by g of h. By a correct perception, I mean one which, while not necessarily perceiving h as having all the qualities which it does have, perceives it as having some of the qualities which it does have, and does not perceive it as having any qualities which it does not have. Each of these states in the misperception series of g factorial h will be a misperception of h as a whole. H, like g, will have such a series within him, and will be perceived by g as having it. But part of the erroneous element of g's perception of h will be to regard this C series as a B series, and, consequently, h will be misperceived by g as existing in time. G, of course, can also perceive himself, in his perception g factorial g, and so misperceive himself as existing in time. Any perception in G will perceive at present whatever in H is at the same stage in the series as himself. It will perceive as future or as past whatever is at a different stage in the series. The only perceptions which are apparent perceptions, that is, which appear to be, as they are, perceptions, are some of those which are at the same stage in the series as their percepta. All others appear not as perceptions, but as judgments, assumptions, or images. But even perceptions, which are at the same stage of the series as their percepta, appear in some cases not as perceptions, but as judgments, assumptions, or images. What is the relation which connects the terms of the series, the relation which, when misperceived as temporal, appears as the relation of earlier and later? In view of the fact that the terms of the series are all states of misperception, while the whole of which they are parts in a state of correct perception, I believe that it can be shown that the terms of the series, though each a part of the whole, do not form a set of parts of the whole, and that no two of them can be mutually outside each other. The only alternative is that of any two terms in the series, one must include the other. We have thus an inclusion series, whose terms are related by the relation included in, and the last term of which will be g factorial h itself, which includes all the others. All the terms of this series, with the exception of g factorial h itself, which is correct, form a misperception series. And when the series is itself misperceived as being in time, the whole inclusion series acts as a C series, i.e., the series which is misperceived as a B series. The last member, however, g factorial h, can never appear as present, for it could only appear as present to a term which was at the same stage in a series as itself, i.e., was a final term in a series. And, as the final terms are not misperceptions, they could not perceive anything as being in time. It follows from the fact that the inclusion series appears as the time series that the time series is limited at both ends, and that a finite number of durations, which are next terms to each other, will exhaust it, in the sense that from any point of it, we shall reach either end of the series in a finite time. When we consider what is meant by the time series in different selves having a common C series, it follows that in either direction, the final terms of the time series of all selves will appear, sub specie temporis, to be simultaneous. We have seen that the relations inclusion of and included in appear sub specie temporis as earlier than and later than. But which of them appears as which? It appears clear that, in the time series, the relation earlier than is more fundamental than the relation later than, since it arranges the terms in order of actual change. And when we look into the exact nature of the inclusion series, there is good reason, I think, to regard the relation included in as more fundamental to it than the relation inclusive of. And from these two results, I think that it is reasonable to conclude that it is the relation included in which appears as the relation earlier than. Then, in the inclusion series of H, it is H itself, which includes all other terms, and is included in none of them, which, when the series appears as a temporal series, will appear as the latest term, as this term contains all the content which is to be found in any part of the series. It may be called the whole of the series. From the standpoint of any other term, it will appear as future, never as past or present. From its own standpoint, however, it will not appear as present, but as timelessly eternal. For this case is not in the misperception series, and so cannot misperceive itself as in time. It follows that the whole is not really future, since nothing is really temporal, but as really future as my breakfast tomorrow is future. We return to the question of immortality. After a finite time, speaking sub specie temporis, each self reaches the term of the whole beyond which there is no other. But that term is the end of the time series. When this term is looked at from the standpoint of any earlier term, sub specie temporis, it will be perceived as unending, which it is, since there is nothing beyond it in that direction, and as being in time. And since we shall reach a state which sub specie temporis is an unending time, it will follow that sub specie temporis we are immortal. We are not really immortal, in the sense which I have taken the word, but this is not because our lives really end, which they do not, but because their unendingness is not an unending duration in time. Thus, the view which has been maintained by some Christians, that heaven is both timeless and future, is not necessarily contradictory. On the other hand, while, sub specie temporis, our lives never end, they do begin. For in this direction, the birth of the series is a zero of content, which is not a term of the series of inclusive contents. And therefore, the whole series will, in this direction, be limited by something outside itself, and so will appear as beginning in time. How long, for each of us, the part of the series before or after the present life is in comparison with that life, we cannot tell. But there seem empirical reasons for supposing that it is very great. That is, that sub specie temporis, a great length of time has passed, from the beginning of time to the birth of my present body, and a great length will pass from the death of my present body till the attainment of the final term. There seem reasons to suppose that both these periods are divided up into a plurality of lives, separated from one another, as the present life of each of us is separated from all that goes before and all that goes after. Footnote. Compare with Some Dogmas of Religion, Chapter 4, and footnote. What can we say of the value in the universe if our theory of nature of the universe is true? People do not agree as to what qualities of the existent give it value, but I think that there would be general agreement that they would not include anything not included in the following list: knowledge, virtue, the possession of certain emotions, happiness, extent and intensity of consciousness, and harmony. We decided of the final states of the inclusion series, those states which were the wholes of the determining correspondence parts, as distinguished from their parts in the discussion of inclusion, that in them the whole content of each self would consist in perceiving selves and their parts and perceiving them correctly, that all their perceptions would be states of acquiescence in what was perceived, that each self would love all the other selves he perceived, and that this would determine his emotions toward himself, towards the selves perceived by the selves whom he perceived, and to the parts of all selves. Now, if this state of things is judged by any or all of the criteria of goodness enumerated in the last paragraph, it will be very good. It will not possess complete good, which is impossible, since there is always a degree of good greater than any given degree of good. But it will possess very much greater good than we ever now experience, and the good will be unmixed with evil. In all the other stages of the inclusion series, which are states of misperception, and whose nature will therefore be different, there is no guarantee that the states will be very good or unmixed with evil. Since our present life is within those stages, we know empirically that they are partly good and partly bad. Can we estimate all the values in the universe, including both the final and the pre-final stages? The pre-final stages appear, sub specie temporis, as the finite in time, the final stage as infinite in time. The value of any stage varies, caeteris paribus, according to its duration in time. But, as the final stage does not appear to itself as in time at all, we cannot infer directly that the value of the final stage is infinitely greater than that of all the rest. I think, however, that good reasons can be given for holding that the limitation or non-limitation of value depends on boundedness or unboundedness, and not on whether this appears sub specie temporis or not. In that case, the final stage will have infinitely more value than the aggregate of all others. And, as the final stage is unmixed good, and the others are mixed good and evil, the universe as a whole, and every self in the universe, is infinitely more good than bad. Although the evil, what there is of it, is just as real as the good. There is, then, a state of very good and unmixed good, which, sub specie temporis, must be regarded as lying in the future, and as being reached in a finite time, while it is itself endless. But the time required to reach it may have any finite length, however great, and we do not know how much evil may await us during that period. What we do know, if our conclusions are correct, is that all the evil of the future and the past are surpassed infinitely in value by the good which lies at the end of time.